So as a child, obviously I was obsessed with Harry Potter and all these classics, and I had never comprehended that these people write books. As a kid, you're like, oh, it's just, you don't see names of your relatives as the authors. My Masi, who is 20 years older than her and I are still very close. She would send me books all the time. And so shout out to Purvi Masi. She sent me this book called The Conch Bearer. And I was like, okay, I just read it. It wasn't the genre I was really used to. It's by Chitra Banerjee Divakarani, um, which now I'm like, you're a big deal. But at the time, I'm like, okay, oh, this looks Indian. And it's about this poor boy who finds a conch, and it's just like this magical journey. And I remember reading that, being like, this is so different from anything I've ever read. And I was definitely in elementary school, middle school. That book I still have at my parents' house. I still remember it because I saw Desi names in a book. And now it's not crazy to see it, but in the 90s, early 2000s, that was not a thing. And still remember, like, as soon as I saw that question in your email, that's the book that popped up. And that was not only the first Desi book I remember reading, or by a book by like a South Asian author, but a book I really enjoyed that was different from the Nancy Drews and the Boxcar Children and all of those that I was reading. So yeah, The Conch Bearer by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, that is always going to be a place in my brain that will never leave. So thank you, Purvi Masi, for that book. I will preface this with, because I'm involved with Lily's library, I read a lot of books all the time. So I'm truly just excited every time a cool plot comes across like my email or something like that. Because there's so many, I will say a book that I recently very enjoyed that I think is really unique. It's Victory City by Salman Rushdie, which, again, he's a huge author, but I've never really read anything by him. So I read this book just like blindly, not really knowing what it's about, and it blew my mind. It's like when I talk about it out loud, it just sounds like I had a bunch of drugs. It's like, what are you saying? But it's like kind of like if someone was like, oh, explain to me what like Harry Potter is about. Like, oh, it's this boy. It's like weird if you just explain it. But when you read it, you're like, this changed my life. And it's this like woman who's now a goddess who lives for hundreds of years, and a city comes out of seeds. And it's like, it's crazy, but it's so fun. And it's one of the few books where I like started geeking out about it with my parents. And as soon as I started talking to them about it, they kind of like picked up on it. And just like the stories, because he wrote this book as if it was like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and then whatever the Victory City book was about. And so I don't know as much about like Hindu and Jain mythology as I should, because I just didn't grow up in India. My parents know a lot about it. So when I was explaining to them the plot of this book, my dad especially was like, wow, like he really just replicated like, this like new world, kind of like the Mahabharata. I'm like, yeah, isn't that cool? And he's like, yeah. And he was driving me back from the airport. He was picking me up, and we just talked about this book for like 30 minutes. And I think that was just like a really fun, fantastical thing. And I always assumed wrongfully that Salman Rushdie was like way too intellectual of an author for me to read. But then I read it, I'm like, this is dope. This is like, I want to watch like an HBO Max. It's like Game of Thrones meets Ramayana meets like feminist it's like amazing. So Victory City by Salman Rushdie has just blown my mind recently. Highly recommend. There's a bunch of cool Desi author and work stuff coming up, but I'll be honest, there's just so much out there that I cannot name just one upcoming, but this is one I recently read that brain sparkles. It's very fun. So I'll start with a story. You can cut this out or keep it in. In our friend group here, as a joke, we were on a road trip. Half the friend group decided to go to a bookstore, and half the friend group decided to like meet us up at this bar we were going to go to. So that as jokingly created two factions. And the friend group that did not go to the bookstore, they deemed themselves like, look at us, we're the illiterates, so we're not as smart as the other friend group going to the bookstore. So I started this ongoing funny thing of like the literates and the illiterates. So anytime somebody would make a decision, someone from the illiterates would be like, let's ask the literates. And it just started out as like a funny thing. And then my husband was like, I should read more. I'm like, okay, how do you want to do that? And he's like, what if you started a book club with just our friend group? I'm like, okay, that sounds great. Let's do it. So quick group chat, put a few people in there. Now we have like 5 people in this book club, and 5 people. We have, yeah, I don't know, 4 or 5 people. We have like a few people in this book club, and the way everybody has started to read. So in this book club, most of them are illiterate crew, which is very, they're like, we don't really read much, but we want to. What they have found helpful in now having read, I think, 5 books over the course of the last year, which is a lot for them. And it actually is a lot. First of all, if you want to start reading, there is no right amount of reading. Don't get intimidated by people who are like, I read like 8 books a month. Like, that's great for them. You could read 1 book a year, that's still reading. So that's number 1. Do not be intimidated by how little or how much you're reading. Number 2, things like a book club, it doesn't need to be official, but find a buddy. That is the biggest takeaway, is find a book that you and a friend think is funny or interesting or cool. It doesn't need to be something as beautiful and like flowery as Salman Rushdie. It could totally be like a beach read book, which is still very viable and still fun. Pick a book you're interested in and find a buddy. Do a buddy system. So have reading dates with your friends, like call them over, just read in silence and chat. My husband really finds it helpful with his friends. He'll invite people over and be like, let's just read. And I love it, but it's very new for them. Or have like a milestone, be like, okay, friend from, long distance friendships are totally a thing, right? So challenge yourselves, like, hey, how about we have a catch up every 2 weeks and let's just try to read 10 pages a day. So having a buddy to be accountable for reading is a great way to connect with your friends, a great way to accidentally finish reading a book, and just a great topic, because now we can make references as a friend group being like, oh my God, like Silent Patient, that was a great twist. Like now we know. Or like, ooh, Anthony Bourdain's memoir. Now we walk back by walking around like restaurants in New York, we'll see his old restaurants and we'll be like, oh yeah. So it's a great way to bond. So find a friend, read a book together. It doesn't need to be fancy. Just find a cool plot. And if you think you need a recommendation, pop into a bookstore and literally ask the employees. That is literally their job. They will give you a great book and walk out. That is it. Find a friend. Don't be intimidated. Reading is fun, especially with other people. And if you don't have friends, the internet exists. So find subreddits, go to Lily's library, or other library-based, communities, and read along. It's the same thing as watching a TV show in my mind. So yeah, pick up a book.